Hello, friends, and today I'm going to speak plainly, without filters, without diplomatic varnish, and without the illusions that have clouded this war for far too long. There are whispers moving quietly through Washington, Moscow, and every corridor where real power flows, whispers of a peace plan that could end the Russia-Ukraine war. For months, the United States has been probing, contacting Russian officials, trying to see whether a negotiated path exists. And yes, I can confirm it. The conversations are happening. I'm in Moscow right now. I've sat face to face with Russian officials, including Maria Zakharova herself. And what I heard was simple. Talks exist, but there is nothing to announce, nothing agreed, nothing assured. And the reason is obvious, because what's on the table, at least from the Western side, is a fantasy. A proposal that asks Russia to accept security guarantees for Ukraine in exchange for territory it already holds by force. Territory it can and will take more of if it chooses. Why would Russia ever agree to this? Why would they limit themselves when the battlefield is tilting entirely in their direction? Let's stop pretending. If the United States won't go to war for Ukraine now, it will not go to war later. Any security guarantee we promise is political theater, a paper shield in a world of hypersonic missiles. And the Russians know it. They also know that time is on their side. Every day the map shifts. Every day Ukraine bleeds more manpower, more civilians, more cities. Russia isn't desperate. They're not seeking a lifeline. They have the luxury of choice, and that alone makes the proposed deal dead on arrival. While these fragile negotiations flicker in the background, something else happened, something reckless, something deeply dangerous. 4 ATACMS missiles, American missiles, were launched toward Russia. And make no mistake, ATACMS cannot be fired without direct U.S. involvement. Somebody in Washington believed that firing 4 missiles, 4 would somehow pressure Russia, somehow compel them to sign a deal they don't need. That is not strategy. That is wishful thinking, weaponized. Russia shot the missiles down. No strategic effect, no leverage gained. And yet, we rolled the dice on escalation anyway. For what? A symbolic gesture? A show of frustration? A gamble with nuclear consequences? This mindset is what keeps the war burning. But the madness doesn't stop there. Back home, some members of Congress are now creating videos telling U.S. soldiers to disobey illegal orders, as if these young men and women, privates, corporals, lieutenants, should carry the legal and moral burden that Congress itself is too afraid to shoulder. If you believe an order is illegal, then you, as a lawmaker, take action. You legislate, you sue, you speak, you fight. You do not dump that responsibility onto a 20-year-old kid holding a rifle. There is a line between an obviously illegal order, kill that civilian, for example, and the murky gray zones where politicians hide their own cowardice. And today, too many are hiding in those gray zones. Meanwhile, Ukraine burns, cities collapse, families bury their dead, and all sides continue playing a geopolitical chess match with real lives, real bodies, real nations on the line. There is only one path out of this tragedy, a negotiated settlement, ugly, painful, but final. Russia won't accept temporary solutions. They won't pause the war today, only to fight it again in 5 years. They are thinking not about headlines, but about history. Not about news cycles, but about the long-term security of their nation. And whether you agree with them or not, they are acting with that clarity. And until Washington begins thinking with equal clarity, this war will not end. I'm going to walk you through, in my own voice, the issues that were discussed with Colonel Douglas Macgregor, including Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, Japan, Korea, Ukraine, Europe, Germany, and even the Epstein files and Donald Trump. I began by considering how reckless it would be for the United States to attack, invade, or attempt to decapitate the leadership of Venezuela. I think it's hard to imagine anything like this happening easily or quickly. I always go back in my mind to our intervention in Vietnam, where people landed on the beach, the Marines went inland, the Army eventually came in, and everyone immediately asked, what are we attacking? What's our objective? After much confusion, they finally came up with one. I look at Venezuela with a 1,700-mile coastline, a 1,380-mile border with Brazil, and a roughly 1,379-mile border with Colombia. And I asked the same question, what are we going to do What are these 17,000 troops in Puerto Rico going to do? How do they get there? Once they arrive, what do they do? I see nothing clear or unambiguous about the thinking or planning behind this thing they're calling Southern Spear. Then I think about what war would actually look like. Would it be boots on the ground? I consider the extraordinary number of American troops in Puerto Rico, and I also take into account the possibility of 10,000 Marines off the coast of Venezuela on various ships. I'd be surprised if they weren't there, because the one thing that's easily seized is the international airport, the Bolivar International Airport. It's right on the coast. A couple of thousand Marines should be able to secure that airport very easily. But what happens after you secure the airport? How do you bring in other troops? Where do they go? Caracas is further inland and it's surrounded by mountains and hills. There are tunnels that go through those mountains and hills into Caracas. How do we get in there? We could fly. We could also have airborne drops. I hear a lot from friends on active duty about repeating Panama. One of the things we did in Panama was an airborne assault. We have all of these light infantry-centric generals at the top of the army who just can't wait to launch another airborne assault. The problem is that Venezuela is not Panama. Venezuela is huge. You can get in fairly easily, particularly given the offshore presence we've got. But then what do you do when you get there, and how do you plan to get out? Unless you can very rapidly install a new government that is friendly to you and can maintain some level of order in the country, you face the possibility of total disintegration of public order. That means you have no control over what goes on inside the country, and everyone and their brother can potentially take a shot at you. They've got about 30 million people. How many of those will resist is anybody's guess, but I just don't see how the Panamanian experience really informs us in Venezuela. There's also talk about going into Venezuela, if for no other reason, to stop the supply of oil to Cuba, which has been an important lifeline. That would align with Secretary of State Rubio's long-term goals in the Caribbean basin. But again, we don't know where all the air and missile defense capabilities are on the ground that the Russians have provided. We're not even sure that what wouldn't ensue is something similar to the proxy war we've been waging in Ukraine against Russia, a war that Russia could turn around and wage in reverse against us in Venezuela using Brazilian, Colombian, and Venezuelan paramilitaries to attack us. In my judgment, the whole thing is a disaster. I then reflect on another aspect. Good God, we've been starving the people of Cuba since 1962. Now we're going to try to cut off their oil. Why? That doesn't change the regime. It just impoverishes the population. Rubio knows that, but he also knows that Cuba is probably weaker today than it has ever been in its history. There's really nothing in Cuba anymore but poverty. He may regard this as a golden opportunity to knock off the regime in Cuba as well, especially once you've strangled the Maduro regime in Caracas. All of this is speculative. Neither I nor most outsiders are privy to those internal discussions or briefings. But looking at the number of forces involved and Venezuela's relationship with Cuba, one has to conclude there's a lot more going on here than simply regime change in Venezuela. Then I turn to the moral and legal dimension. There has to be some moral or legal basis for what the government does. What kind of threat does Cuba pose to the United States of America? They can barely feed their people. I don't want to make us responsible for Cuba. I don't want to make the United States and the American people responsible for Venezuela. Let's set aside any altruistic motives. I think of Reinhold Niebuhr, paraphrasing. The challenge in U.S. foreign policy is to link the contingencies of power with the principles of justice. I don't think the principles of justice mean anything anymore in Washington, D.C. They haven't for a very long time. So what are we really looking at? We're looking at a way to collateralize all of these mineral resources, oil, gas, emeralds, gold, rare earths, all that sort of thing. People in the banking industry have privately told me, if you can go in there and exert absolute authority over the country and exploit its resources without interruption, that could conceivably lead to a massive reduction in our national sovereign debt. You could pull 19 trillion in wealth out of Venezuela. That would roughly cut our national sovereign debt in half. In other words, this is an old-fashioned exercise in pillaging and exploiting other people's resources. At this point, I ask the obvious question that many people are thinking. Are the same Zionist billionaires behind Trump's stances and threats of war against Iran also behind this idea of invading Venezuela? I suspect so, because they have a lot more at risk right now. They're fighting tooth and nail to maintain the dollar's dominance. That story just doesn't reach the American public. We are in a state of decline in terms of economic strength, military power, prosperity, internal cohesion across the board. The Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, and others see us as a potentially dangerous and irrational actor on the world stage. As Jeffrey Sachs and others have said, they are trying to manage their way through what they perceive as our decline by avoiding a war. That gets harder and harder. We failed in Russia. We wanted to go in, break the country up, and strip it of its resources. That has failed miserably. We have not destroyed the national cohesion of Iran, nor do we control its oil and gas resources. Now we have China, which imports roughly 80% of Iran's oil, very interested in ensuring the Strait of Hormuz stays open. How far can we press this war with Iran? That leads our elites to look for new places where they can access resources to boost the American economy and deal with this enormous sovereign national debt. So yes, I imagine some of the same billionaires who were involved in the conflict with Russia and the conflict with Iran and the Greater Israel Project are also very interested in Venezuela, because it may be that the other two projects are going to fail. One can argue they've already failed in Russia. The next question is, are we ever going to make any progress in the Middle East? It doesn't look very encouraging right now. So Venezuela becomes attractive, low-hanging fruit in some people's minds. The Venezuelans, however, have millions of members in militias. I don't know what kind of central command they have or how those militias would operate, but if we were bogged down in a land war, that could have consequences far beyond Venezuela. For example, would that delay any Israeli attempt to go after Iran? The Israelis are not going to invade Iran. They want to destroy Iran and ultimately capture its oil resources. In that sense, Israel functions as a beachhead for international finance in New York and London, both wanting to capture those resources. But the possibility that they can do that is getting less and less likely in the current environment. It's not necessarily impossible yet, but it's not encouraging. That's why Venezuela looks easier on paper. The problem is, what if it turns into a long-term insurgent war that we frankly have no interest in fighting, especially if it's orchestrated and partially supported by Russia? If you were Russian, looking at the damage we've tried to inflict on Russia for over 3.5 years, wouldn't it occur to you to exact some retribution? I think it would. From there, I turn my focus to Asia. I ask myself whether Japan should host US nuclear weapons, and whether the Prime Minister of Japan should be threatening to attack China if Beijing asserts more control over Taiwan than she thinks appropriate. The Japanese have reined her in. In Japan, the government's foreign and defense policy are effectively run by the imperial bureaucracy, a bureaucracy staffed with historic aristocratic families that have shaped elite thinking and culture for centuries. They're loyal to the emperor and tend to define what foreign and defense policy will look like. They also have a big impact internally. She went too far. The Japanese have already sent delegations to China to patch up the damage. Japan and China, like Korea and China, will never be allies, in my judgment. But they also know that a war between them would be singularly stupid and counterproductive. So her remarks have been walked back. The real issue for Japan now is this. They are waiting, like the Koreans, for us to leave. That may sound strange to Americans, but people in Northeast Asia are extremely polite. They would like us to go. We have served their purpose long enough. Japan profited enormously from America's military shield, but now Japan doesn't need it and doesn't want it. Japan can build its own nuclear capability. It could become a nuclear power virtually overnight. It has an interest in that, not because it wants to use nuclear weapons, but because it wants to be a free agent, not dependent on us. It wants to interact with Russia, China, and others as it sees fit. When Trump was in Japan, they made it clear in private, we like you and will support you, but we're not going to join your embargo on Russia. We're going to keep buying oil and gas from Russia. A Japanese parliamentarian bluntly stated that Russia is concerned if they sign a peace treaty and return the islands taken at the end of World War II, the U.S. might place military installations there. That fear is legitimate from the Russian perspective. It is also in Japan's interest to show that it will not do that. Japan wants to be an independent free agent. It's been 80 years since the end of the Second World War. They want to be cut loose politely. The same is true in Korea. The liberal nationalist government in South Korea wants us to leave. They know there will never be peace on the peninsula as long as we are there. We're no longer a shield, we're a catalyst for conflict with North Korea. China wants nothing to do with North Korea. China wants to do business with South Korea. Think of the Koreas as East and West Germany at the end of the Cold War. Moscow had to decide where the future lay. It was not with the GDR, it was with West Germany. Similarly, Beijing sees the future in the Republic of Korea. We, however, are always trying to pull people into a position of hostility toward anyone we don't like. They don't want to be hostile to Russia or China. The Japanese prime minister has been reprimanded and told to sit down and be quiet. That's being patched up with China. There will be no more of that. But the Chinese still fear Japan more than they fear us. Japan is right offshore and is the sleeping superpower. People mock Japan for not spending enough on defense or having a low birth rate. My message is stand by. If we get out of the way, Japan will fill the contained China role we keep trying to fulfill at enormous cost. Everything from the water's edge in Asia, from the Chinese coast, southwest or east, will be under Japan's effective influence at sea. China will dominate on land, Japan at sea. That's where things are headed. We are holding up the train because we want to live permanently in the afterglow of World War II. We can't afford it and we don't need it. I then turn back to Europe and Ukraine. I note how profound and clear this analysis is compared to what many of our current political figures are capable of. Most of them don't have the knowledge, understanding, analytical skills, or will to speak to a president this way. I also recall something attributed to Trump in The Art of the Deal. Never hire anyone who is smarter than you. That is catastrophic thinking in a leader. It should be the opposite. Surround yourself with people smarter than you in their domains. In the past week, the depth of corruption in President Zelensky's government has become a public conversation in Kyiv and elsewhere. We've long known how bad it is, and it absolutely affects the war from the beginning and still today. Zelensky is on very fragile ground, as is his inner circle. They see the handwriting on the wall. What is stopping Putin and the Russian military from launching straight to the Dnieper River and ultimately crossing and seizing Kyiv? The answer is Vladimir Putin himself. From the very beginning, he has desperately wanted to avoid a war with us or NATO. When we met him and his team in Saudi Arabia with Secretary Rubio and others, what Russia wanted was to restore relations and do business with us. That has always been central to his strategic thinking. That means he doesn't want to cross that river and assume responsibility for the ruin of Ukraine, at least not under current circumstances. That may be why we're now in discussions with him. Maybe someone finally figured out that he does not want to conquer all of Ukraine. The idea that he wants to is crazy. No one in their right mind would want to take responsibility for that mess. The tragedy is that corruption is so bad that wounded Ukrainian soldiers and officers have had to pay someone to take them to a hospital. Widows and orphans of Ukrainian soldiers aren't getting their benefits. The checks that should go to them are being pocketed by battalion and brigade commanders. Everyone is involved in this giant grift. Some officials are being accused of stealing hundreds of millions, but people familiar with the situation tell me Zelensky likely has at least $1 billion in cash. Most people have stolen billions. These hundreds of millions cases are small fry. That reality is beginning to sink in across Europe. But the globalists can't admit it because it would mean admitting they were wrong from the beginning, that Russia is not the existential threat they claimed. And if they admit that, how do they justify staying in power, especially when Europe is in social, economic, and political crisis? So they cling on and keep resisting any attempt to end the war, honestly. Recently, Reuters reported secret negotiations between Steve Witkoff and his counterpart in the Kremlin, a wealthy businessman educated at Stanford, about new and extensive U.S. Russia talks on peace in Ukraine and a reset of relations. This morning I was given the opportunity to question Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry, and I asked her directly about this. She flatly denied it. I don't know if these conversations are so secret she doesn't know about them, or if she just didn't want to reveal anything on international television. But the point remains, Trump is allegedly bypassing Secretary of State Rubio to use Steve Witkoff to try to solve one of the world's most intractable problems. Whatever the solution is, whatever Witkoff has offered, it cannot be less than what Putin's demands have consistently been from day one. Putin has said he is pleased that, for the first time, Russian interests are at least being taken into account. That's encouraging. but we have to be careful. We've seen cycles of euphoria and depression before with peace hours away that never materialized. I would love to see peace come to Ukraine. That would be the best thing for the people who live there. It is appropriate that Trump and Putin sit down with their teams and draw a new map. That's how wars in Europe have been ended for hundreds of years. You redraw borders to address legitimate national security concerns. But who takes over in Ukraine? Russia's position, and I'm sympathetic because we in the U.S. have felt similarly before, is that they don't want to fight this war again. They don't want a peace that fails to fundamentally change Ukraine into a neutral state with a government completely divorced from Zelensky and his banderist nationalist base. If they can't get that, it doesn't matter where you draw the lines or what promises are made, there will be another war in a few years. That's the crux. Zelensky is squeezed between hardline nationalists who threaten him and a public that is disgusted by corruption and aware that he's not even the legally elected head of state anymore. It makes you wonder how he can agree to anything. How could he possibly agree to surrender land that is historically Russian, where 90% of the territory is now dominated by the Russian military, but which his nationalist faction would rather die than concede? That could be arranged, so to speak, by the Russians on the battlefield. The real issue for Zelensky is, can he be given an out? Will someone from the CIA or MI6 sit him down and say, game over, you need to leave? The arrangement will be made in Washington and Moscow. You can express your hopes, but you don't have to be part of it. We'll fly you out. He could then go where some of his associates who've stolen hundreds of millions have already gone, Israel. He too is Jewish. He could go there, not be extradited, and be safe from prosecution in Netanyahu's Israel. That may be the best solution for him personally. I think the game is up for him. Someone has to explain it and provide him with an exit. Someone else will step forward in Ukraine. Whether that person is acceptable to Russia is debatable, but Russia will probably tolerate it if it ends this travesty of a war. The real problem then becomes our European allies. Putin assumed that Trump, as U.S. president, was de facto leader of NATO, and that if Trump said, we're going to do X, NATO allies would follow. That used to be true 30, 40, 50 years ago. It is not clearly true today. Still, Putin is willing to compartmentalize. He wants good relations with us and wants to do business with us. So you could see an agreement that gives Trump an optically pleasing moment, restored relations between Moscow and Washington, even if NATO allies drag their feet. Trump needs the optics and historical credit for having done something great. I think the Russians will accommodate that to the extent they can, provided he recognizes the facts on the ground in Ukraine. It will be up to Trump to drag Europeans along. That may be difficult until current governments fall, and they will, though perhaps not as fast as we'd like. I've personally asked Maria Zakharova what it would take for me to fly from JFK to Moscow in 9 hours instead of 20 hours via Istanbul or Doha. She laughed and said, ask Mr. Trump. These sanctions are his, not ours. That says everything. Trump wants to be seen as the strong man who drove whatever agreement Putin signs. The Russians will likely accommodate that because they are sick of the whole thing and they know the Ukrainian people have had enough. Journalists returning from Western Ukraine report the population is ready to quit. Many Ukrainians west of the Dnieper openly say, we don't want another war. And the best way to avoid another war is to have a government in Kyiv that is friendly to Moscow. They know and understand that there is hope, but we must scale back our expectations. It's very iffy. Then I look ahead to Germany. Is Germany going to leave NATO and the EU to become independent again? It will have to. It doesn't have any choice. The globalist framework is a legacy of World War II. Remember the old line, NATO exists to keep the Russians out and the Germans down? In the 1,990 seconds, that enraged me, because the Germans were probably the single most reliable and loyal component of NATO. The Germans have had it. When this government falls, whatever replaces it will be nationalist. The same will happen in many countries. France first, Britain first, Germany first. In Germany, it may go further, Germany only. Germans are tired of being treated as a cash cow. Go to Italy or France and they blame everything on Germany. It's absurd. But Germans have indeed been the cash cow, walking into rooms with their heads down saying, we know we're bad. How much money do you want? So The Austrians have escaped much of this by convincing the world that Beethoven was Austrian and Hitler was German, when the opposite is true. Historically, a disproportionate number of concentration camp commanders were Austrians. But the guilt narrative has been pinned primarily on Germany, and the Germans have lived in a kind of psychological Stockholm syndrome. That's ending. A younger generation wants nothing to do with inherited guilt and doesn't want to be exploited by the EU anymore. Germany has been effectively deindustrialized and pushed toward near poverty by EU structures. Germans are looking at NATO and asking, how is NATO providing for our security? When there was a Soviet Union, the answer was debatable. Today, NATO is either out of area or out of business. Either NATO gets dragged into our imperial adventures or it has no purpose. Germans have never wanted to be part of our imperial adventures and have scrupulously avoided most of them. Germany will leave NATO and the EU. When it does, it will regain its former position in Europe and restore relations with Russia. Over the last 400 years, except for 2 avoidable world wars, relations between Germany and Russia have often been good. Any reconciliation has always been seen by Anglo powers as dangerous, but it isn't dangerous to us. It is only dangerous to France and Britain's sense of strategic importance. A German-Russian axis is huge and powerful economically, and Russia would like that restored, though right now they don't see it as possible, so they focus on Eurasia. These dramatic changes would benefit everybody in Germany, but they probably won't happen under Chancellor Merz. He will have to go. We've seen a succession of leaders, some understanding the dynamics but not willing to act. Those days of complacency are ending. Europe, including Germany, is dealing with mass immigration, rising crime, and social strain that people never ask for and don't want. They're tired of being told they are evil and must accept endless burdens. Eventually, people wake up. Germans are waking up. It will take time, but the handwriting is on the wall. We should welcome their independence instead of trying to keep them as vassals. Insisting on vassal status would be catastrophic. On a lighter but telling note, I also think about how the Russians, Chinese, Japanese, and South Koreans see a U.S. president when he behaves as Trump did in that Epstein clip, denying, lashing out at reporters, calling Epstein a Democrat hoax, calling the press terrible people, and refusing to release the files. Add to that his defense of Mohammed bin Salman over the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, even when U.S. intelligence concluded MBS ordered it. Then we hear claims that peace has broken out in Gaza while Palestinians are dying and infrastructure is being destroyed. It is absurd. One of the worst things I've heard is that this 28-point proposal with Russia is allegedly modeled on the successful ceasefire in Gaza. There is no successful ceasefire in Gaza. If that's the model, you can write the whole thing off now. Trump has a bad habit of shooting from the hip and being guided too much by emotion. When the Epstein files come out, will we just see page after page of redacted black ink? If he had joked and said, yes, it proves I like girls, people might have giggled and he might have gotten away with it temporarily. But his reaction, anger, and condemnation is telling. Months ago, someone told me Epstein is going to bring down Donald Trump. I was skeptical then, but it may tragically turn out to be true. That, in essence, is the arc of this discussion, from Venezuela to Cuba, Iran, Japan, Korea, Ukraine, Germany, NATO, the EU, and the Epstein-Trump angle, all seen through one lens. I am Larry C. Johnson, and I am trying to describe, as honestly as I can, how dangerous, how unstable, and how avoidable much of this truly is.